Welcome to our deep dive, everyone. We're tackling excerpts from Making Distinctions today. This text really gets you thinking about how we categorize, how we differentiate, and how that shapes what we think is real, and, well, how that might be leading us astray.
Absolutely, yeah.
So let's jump right in.
Okay.
The source dives right into math, using something as simple as a line to make its point. I mean, math, you think that would be super precise.
You would think, right.
Yeah.
But the text points out that when we try to represent a line, which is continuous, with numbers, like we do on a number line, it's inherently flawed, right? You can't have those discrete numbers representing something continuous.
Yeah, it's almost like you're trying to build, like, a smooth curve with Lego bricks. You can get close, but there's always going to be gaps.
Right.
So does infinity solve that? Just cram in infinite points and we're good.
Well, the source makes a pretty compelling argument against infinity, and it boils down to this. To have infinity, you need a really solid definition of what's finite. And that gets surprisingly tricky. You know, at some point, numbers get so large that they kind of lose their practical meaning in calculations. It's like...
So are you saying those endless decimals in pi or like the square root of 2, those aren't real numbers?
It's more about recognizing that our tools have limitations, you know? We use these symbols, and they're super useful for approximations, but they're not representing some, like, perfectly defined quantity out there.
Okay.
It's more like a fuzzy boundary between very large and truly infinite.
Interesting. Okay, but how does a theoretical math problem like that affect us out here in the real world?
Well, that's a crucial question for you, the listener, to consider. How precise does math actually need to be for us to use it every day? Does this change how you think about the numbers that you encounter all the time?
That's a really good point. Okay, let's move from these theoretical numbers to the actual physical world. The source argues that even what seems like a clear distinction, the one between us as the observers and the environment we observe, that actually breaks down at a microscopic level.
It's true. Think about this. We see our skin as separate from the air around us. Right. But if you were to zoom in, way in, that boundary starts to get really fuzzy.
Yeah.
At the atomic level, it's all this constant exchange and interaction.
Yeah.
It's hard to say where we end and the world begins.
So the line between the observer and the observed, maybe that's more of a human-made concept than some fundamental truth about the universe.
Exactly. And it makes you wonder, doesn't it? What if what we perceive as separate, distinct objects are really just like expressions of a single continuous substance that underlies everything?
Hold on. If everything is ultimately connected like that, doesn't that just completely mess up the scientific method, which relies on that separation?
Right. And the text tackles that head on. Imagine this. You're trying to study this continuous substance with some kind of scientific instrument.
Okay.
But that instrument, by definition, is made of the same substance you're trying to study. We're kind of trapped in a loop, only able to get these indirect glimpses of what's really going on.
Okay. My brain's doing backflips here. But let's stick with this idea of challenging distinctions. The source also goes after how we think about time.
Yeah.
You know, we experience time as this continuous flow, always changing. But then we chop it up into seconds, minutes, hours.
Right, we try to tame it with numbers.
Right.
And that creates a disconnect, doesn't it? The source introduces this fascinating concept of the in-between. So imagine zooming in on a tiny segment of time. No matter how small you go, there's always a little bit between any 2 points you pick. And this in-between, our current math can't fully grasp it.
And the source says that trying to add this in-between to our models, that would be like admitting our own ignorance.
Precisely. It would be saying, hey, our tools aren't good enough to fully describe what continuity really is, whether it's time, space, or anything else. We'd be formalizing our own limitations.
So how does that challenge your understanding of cause and effect? You know, does it blur the lines between past, present, future?
You know, that's a great point. It definitely makes you rethink how we perceive time. And this actually ties back into a bigger idea that the source keeps coming back to, the building blocks of reality itself.
I mean, like going back to the line example, that issue of using numbers to describe something that's continuous.
Exactly. The text really emphasizes that numbers, by their nature, they force us to think in discrete terms. Even when we're trying to represent something that flows continuously, it's like trying to describe a smooth, flowing river, but you can only talk about separate buckets of water.
Okay, so how do we escape that trap?
The source proposes this radical shift. Embrace this in-between, not just as a math concept, but as a fundamental building block of reality. Think of it as a continuous segment, connected by points, but those points act more like glue.
They allow for both flow and structure.
It's like acknowledging there's something more there than what our tools can capture.
Right, and this circles back to that idea of nature itself being this continuous material. It's just locally manifesting properties that we then perceive as these separate, distinct things. It really challenges how we normally categorize and differentiate.
Wow, we've covered a lot already. I think we need a moment to let all of this sink in.
Let's take a moment to reflect on how these ideas challenge our understanding, not just of abstract things like math and time, but the very nature of reality itself.
Okay, so we've talked about how our need to categorize and draw these distinctions, while it's useful, can also create some blind spots. So where do we go from here? What does it mean to live in a world where these distinctions might be more about how we see things and less about some absolute reality? Well, it really forces us to reconsider some pretty fundamental ideas. And maybe the biggest one is the concept of self. We tend to think of ourselves as these individuals separate from the world. But what if that separation is more of an illusion? What does that mean for our identity?
Yeah, does it mean there's no real distinction between me and you, or even me and that tree over there? Are we all just expressions of the same stuff deep down?
Those are some really profound questions. And while the source doesn't necessarily give us any clear-cut answers, it definitely pushes us to re-examine those assumptions.
So where do we even begin to get our heads around this? Does the source give us any guidance?
Well, it emphasizes this need to develop a new perspective. It actually even recommends a book with that very title, suggesting that our current ways of thinking might just be too limited.
Okay, but what does a new perspective even look like? I mean, all our tools for understanding math, science, language, they all rely on making distinctions. Are we just supposed to throw all that out?
I don't think it's about discarding our tools completely. It's more about recognizing that they have limitations and being open to new possibilities. Remember that in-between concept. Adding that to our mathematical models could be a step towards acknowledging that continuity is something we can't fully grasp with our discrete tools.
So it's about embracing the unknown, admitting that we don't have all the answers.
Exactly. And maybe even questioning the very questions that we're asking. Maybe our current methods are inherently flawed if nature doesn't operate based on the same kind of distinctions that we do.
I have to say, this is starting to feel a bit overwhelming. Are we saying that everything we thought we knew is wrong?
Not necessarily wrong, but perhaps incomplete. It's like we've been looking at the world through a specific set of lenses, and now we're being asked to consider that there might be other lenses out there, lenses that could be more revealing.
And maybe those other lenses will reveal parts of reality that we've been blind to this whole time.
That's the exciting part. It's about pushing the boundaries of our understanding. But I know this can all feel a bit abstract. So how do we actually apply this new perspective to our everyday lives?
Yeah, that's a good question. I'm struggling with that too. It's like, intellectually, I get it, but how do I actually live differently knowing this?
Well, maybe instead of focusing on separation and difference, we start paying more attention to connection and interdependence. Remember how even the distinction between ourselves and the environment breaks down at a microscopic level?
Yeah, it really made me realize how interconnected we are with everything around us.
And that's a good starting point. Shifting our focus from the parts to the whole. Maybe that subtle change in perspective can open up new ways of understanding not just the universe, but ourselves, too.
Okay, I can see where you're going with this. But I have to admit, I'm still kind of attached to those distinctions. They feel so fundamental to how I make sense of the world.
It's totally understandable to feel that way. Our brains are wired to categorize and differentiate. It's how we navigate and make choices.
So how do we reconcile that with this idea that those distinctions might be illusions?
Again, I don't think it's about getting rid of them entirely. It's more about realizing that they're tools, not absolute truths. We can still use them, but with a healthy dose of skepticism, and a willingness to consider other perspectives.
So use them wisely, knowing they might not be telling the whole story. Okay, I can buy that. But I'm curious about the specific implications for how we understand the universe. You mentioned new avenues for exploration. What are some examples?
Well, think about the source's proposition that nature is this single continuous substance that could completely revolutionize physics. Our current models, which are based on discrete particles and forces, they might need a total overhaul.
So everything we thought we knew about gravity, electromagnetism, all those fundamental forces of nature, it might all need to be reframed within this new understanding of a continuous reality.
Potentially, yeah. This could have ripple effects in fields like cosmology, quantum mechanics, even computer science, and it doesn't stop there.
What about consciousness? If the boundary between self and other is blurry, what does that mean for how we understand subjective experience?
It raises some really fascinating questions. If we're all fundamentally interconnected, what does that mean for how we perceive the world, our relationships, even the possibility of a collective consciousness? This isn't just about physics and math anymore. It's about the very essence of what it means to be human.
I'm both excited and a little terrified by all of this. It's like we're standing at the edge of this vast, unexplored territory.
That's the beauty of it, right? We're venturing into the unknown, where anything is possible. This new perspective invites us to rethink everything, to explore new frontiers of knowledge. It's an incredible opportunity.
Okay, I'm ready for the challenge. But before we dive any deeper, I think we need a moment to just let all of this settle in.
I agree. We've covered some pretty complex terrain here. This is a good time to reflect on what it means to challenge those deep-seated assumptions about how we see the world. We'll wrap up this exploration in the final part of our deep dive.
All right, welcome back, everyone. We're wrapping up our deep dive into making distinctions today. It's been a wild ride, questioning these lines that we draw between concepts, between ourselves and the world around us, even between, like, me and you.
We've really been pushing at the edges of how we see things. It's not about saying that everything we know is wrong, but acknowledging that our perception might be a lot more limited than we realize.
Yeah, it's like we've been looking at a pointillist painting up close,
Yeah.
seeing all those separate dots. But now we're stepping back and this whole image is starting to emerge, One that was always there but kind of hidden in plain sight.
And that new image, with all its blurred boundaries and interconnectedness, it doesn't like invalidate those dots, right? It just adds another layer of understanding, a deeper complexity.
So how do we take all this heady theoretical stuff and make it, well, practical? What are the real-world implications of this new perspective?
Well, let's start with science. This idea of a continuous underlying substance, it could really revolutionize physics. Imagine rethinking our models of fundamental forces, particles, understanding them not as separate things, but as expressions of one unified reality.
We're talking about more than just tweaking existing theories here, right? This could be like a complete paradigm shift, rewriting the physics textbooks.
It really could be. And the implications could be huge, impacting fields like cosmology, quantum mechanics, even how we develop new technologies.
And what about the impact on how we understand consciousness? We touched on this idea of the self earlier. If that boundary between me and everything else isn't so clear-cut, what does that mean for our experience of the world?
Yeah, well, it brings up all these fascinating questions about the nature of subjective experience, perception, even the potential for interconnectedness between minds. If we're all expressions of the same underlying substance, could there be some deeper level of connection, like a sort of collective consciousness that we haven't tapped into yet?
So this goes way beyond these abstract concepts like math and physics. It gets to the core of what it means to be human, how we relate to each other, our place in the universe, the really big questions about existence itself.
You're getting it. This isn't just an intellectual exercise, It's about expanding our understanding of reality and ourselves.
I'm feeling both excited and kind of overwhelmed at the same time. It's like we've cracked open the door to this vast, unexplored landscape, and I'm not sure which direction to even go first.
Well, it's a natural reaction. The source material doesn't give us the step-by-step guide or anything, but it offers a starting point. Cultivate a new perspective.
Okay, so how do we actually do that? How do we shift our thinking, our perception, even our way of being in the world?
It starts with questioning those assumptions. Being okay with ambiguity, admitting that we don't have all the answers, and just being open to new ways of seeing. It's a process, one of continual exploration and discovery.
And the source specifically mentions that book, New Perspective. That sounds like it might be a good place for our listeners to continue this journey on their own.
I think that's a great idea. And, as we wrap up our deep dive here, I want to leave you with one final thought. What if this challenge to the distinctions we make, this blurring of boundaries, what if it's pointing towards a truth that's even grander, more unified, more awe-inspiring than anything we can currently imagine?
That's a really powerful image to end on. It reminds me that maybe letting go of those rigid distinctions, maybe it's not about losing something, but opening ourselves up to a reality that's far richer and more interconnected than we ever thought possible. Thanks for joining us, everyone. And a special thanks to our expert guest for this fascinating deep dive.
Thanks for having me.